Will you veto any legislation that extends all of the Bush tax cuts, even to what you call the wealthy?
Yes, and the reason is we can't afford it. I mean, it would cost us $1 trillion.
So there you have it. President Obama threatening to block any bill that would extend the Bush tax rates across the board. He's determined to raise taxes for top-earning Americans, and he says that families earning less than $250,000 deserve to keep the current tax rate that we're under at the moment. I'm joined now by Utah Senator Orrin Hatch. She is the ranking member on the Senate Finance Committee. Senator, good morning. Good to have you with us.
Good morning.
So what do you think about
that?
The president says, good to have you with us, sir. The president says that if any bill is brought to him, and this would be similar to what he was in favor of last time, to extend all of the Bush tax cuts, he says this time he will veto. What do you say, sir?
Well, the president's playing class warfare as usual. You know, back in 2010, he said that if we increased taxes, it would really hurt the economy because it would be mainly taxes against small businesses. His approach would tax about 940,000, almost 1 million small businesses. That's 25% of the total workforce in this country. And he said back in 2010 it would damage the economy to do that. Now he's willing to do that because he's playing class warfare. He knows we're not going to do that, but he wants to make as many political points as he can, and that's not a very good political point in my opinion, because you know, and then they go back to, well, President Clinton raised taxes. Yeah, he did raise taxes, but he also cut spending. This president hasn't cut a dime of spending. In fact, spending has gone up dramatically, and to increase taxes on those making more than $250,000, he doesn't get that much of a payback for it. It may damage the economy, and in the end, we're just going to have more spending without any real reductions that are necessary to get this economy moving again.
So you say it's not going to happen the way that he's laying it out, that it couldn't pass on Capitol Hill the way that he's laying it out. You know, in terms of the politics of all of this, so I can only assume that he's making a bet that people will be on his side, and the polls seem to back that up. If you ask people, you know, do you think that people making over $250,000 should pay a little bit more, should pay their fair share, as he puts it? The polls seem to back that up, that most people agree that that's an okay thing to do. So how does all of this play out politically in the end for your party?
Well, keep in mind, if he continues with that, we're not going to allow that to happen. If that happens, he's going to find a real problem with the economy. If he would happen to win on that, he's not going to win on it. The House isn't going to vote for that. We all know that.
But what about in the presidential election? I mean, you're claiming that's what it's really all about. So can that help him win in the presidential election is my question.
I don't think so, because I think Mitt Romney can easily explain that that's not economically a sound way to go. Plus, look, the president doesn't know how to create jobs. He has absolutely zero background in job creation. He spent most of his life as a community organizer. He was a part-time law professor, or should I say law instructor is where he was. And I give him credit for all that, but that doesn't mean creation of jobs. Not only that, but President Clinton is against this. Former President Clinton. Alice Rivlin's against it. I have to say that Larry Summers, his former chief economic advisor, said it's not the right thing to do. And if you look at hammering another 940,000 small businesses, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Plus, to say that, you know, look, to say that the wealthy, if you hammer the wealthy like he'd like to do, I'm not sure you'd get that much in revenues. They'd find other ways of leaving the country or putting their businesses overseas or finding a way to not have to put up with the high taxes. He's talking about raising taxes well over 40%. My gosh, there isn't anybody that I know who thinks that's a good idea.
According to the Treasury, it would raise about $85 billion. And according to the Treasury's numbers as well, that's what the federal government spends in about 8 days. So it would raise about 8 days worth of spending. And as you point out, there's not a lot of talk about spending cuts. So that I go back to my other point, that it can only bring us to the conclusion that he believes that this will win with the American people, that this idea of like they need to pay their fair share, folks, that it's resonating and that it's working for him.
Well, I don't think that it is. I think American people, well, there is a problem here. We all know that the bottom 51% of all households, according to the Joint Committee on Taxation, they don't pay any income taxes at all. And I think the Democrats would like to get that to 60% of people who are totally dependent upon all the rest of the people who work. In other words, dependent on the federal government. And that's not the way to pull our country out of the doldrums it's in, and it's clearly not the way that that anybody with an economic background would want to advocate. And I have to say, this president has no basic knowledge or ability to create jobs. His lifetime exposure, though important and intelligent and all that, really had nothing to do with the creation of jobs or creation of opportunities for people to get out and work, and especially small business people at that.
And what do you think Americans can assume if this goes through, if he is able to raise taxes, which you say probably won't, but for the sake of our discussion, if he gets an extra $85 billion from those people over 250,000, what does that money go towards? You know, how is he proposing the government will use that $85 billion to try to create jobs? Will they be government generated?
Well, when are we going to wake up in this country? We know that these Democrats, and especially this president, is not going to use that money to pay down the national debt, which is astronomical right now. Our national debt is now 103% of GDP. Just to put that in perspective, Spain is in real trouble over in Europe, and its national debt is less than 70% of GDP. And yet, we're talking about Europeanizing America and making it even less responsive than it is and responsible than it is today. And that comes from a president who really has zero background in economics and zero background in job creation. That's why Mitt Romney's going to win this election. People realize that he has the ability to do so, he has the background to do so, and they deep down feel that this president isn't up to that job.
Well, this is seizing on the central question of this election and how we fix the economy.
Yeah.
Sir, thank you so much. Senator Orrin Hatch, always a pleasure. Good to have you with us.
Nice to be with you. Good to be with you.
22 minutes now before the hour, and 80,000 jobs in June, well below the number economists say is needed to show a